I ache to make this point because I think arguably you just read at the end of the last session a chapter that contains arguably, and this even an atheist who shares our values can agree to, the most relevant verse perhaps in the New Testament. This translation, we're using different translation, doesn't matter. He's speaking about the scribes and the Pharisees with whom he has big problems. Therefore, whatsoever they bid you observe, that observe and do. But do not ye after their works, for they say and do not. So let me give one out of an almost infinite number of examples of the relevance. Those who dismissed the founding fathers of the United States because they had slaves. So we won't listen to what they say because they had slaves. That violates this very principle here. Listen to what they said. We're not asking you to have slaves. You have to be able to separate people from what they advocate. If everybody who advocates something good has to be essentially perfect, we will take no lessons from anyone. This is, I cannot overstate the brilliance and relevance of that verse.
I think that also harkens back, let's say, to Ham's attitude towards Noah, right? Noah ends up drunk and splayed out in a tent after he shepherds his family through the storm, and Ham takes that opportunity to make fun of him and to invite his brothers to join in on the humiliation. His brothers refuse to do so. And when Noah awakens from his drunken stupor, which I suppose in some ways was in fact a shameful display, let's say, he tells Ham that his descendants will be the servants of slaves and that his other sons' children will dominate them forever. The idea there being something like those who refuse to honor their mother and father will end up as slaves. And it's very much akin to what you're describing, which is that you have no call to hold people to a standard that you can't possibly make manifest yourself. And there's nothing but hypocrisy in your willingness to throw out the best of the past because the past was also as corrupt as the present, let's say.
By the way, the inverse is true. There are some very fine people with horrible ideas. So the relationship between the individual and the idea is not necessarily one-to-one.
One of the things that's happened now with the advent of social media and phones and everybody recording everybody and many people willfully giving up their privacy is we have a window into what everyone does. And as we discussed in the last session, if there's no longer a mechanism to forgive and there's no longer any way possible to forget because everything has been enshrined, we're stuck in this hellish loop because there's no forgiveness and there's no forgetting.
Dennis, how is what you said different from what people on our side might say about climate activists who, I think somebody mentioned earlier, who have flights and cars and all of that?
How would it relate to people who
advocate for something while not practicing the thing that they're advocating? We say climate activists are hypocrites.
Climate activists. So how
because they're hypocritical.
I dismiss. No. The fact that they will fly their private jets to climate conference.
Why should we not listen to them and ignore their misdeeds?
The reason I don't listen to them has nothing to do with the hypocrisy of their flying private jets. It's because what they say is so spectacularly, dangerously foolish that the imminent demise of the world. It's like a riddle I invented. What do you call a religious man who says the world is coming to an end? A fanatic. What do you call a secular person who says the world is coming to an end? An environmentalist. They are the equivalent of that religious fanatic. The world is coming to an end. I dismiss what they say, and because they suppress all scientists who differ with them, it proves to me that I can't trust them. But it's not because of their hypocrisy.
Christ is a master at using short, mysterious stories. They change the listener who takes them seriously.
The person that you do not think could ever be virtuous, well, let me show you. This is the person who is fulfilling the law and the prophets.
I don't believe in that promise. I'll just be honest on this point.
Then it hit me. I saw it.
This Jew is very frightened of a post-Christian society.
The power of love.
I don't want to be in a Hallmark card, I tell you.
We've got our work cut out for us, gentlemen. I sure hope we're up to the task.
There's two different critiques. There's a critique of an argument and there's critique of character. And the mistake is to say you only need one or the other, or to conflate them or confuse
The
them.
reason I brought it up is I may be misremembering, but I thought we made that very same argument in the previous session.
In this case, though, yes, in this case, there's also an aspect which is authority, which is the idea that the Pharisees are sitting in the seat of Moses. That's what Jesus is saying. That means that they are the spiritual authority at the time. To the extent that they're sitting in the seat of Moses, listen to what they say. It's not like whatever they think. It's like because they're manifesting the tradition down to the people. It's like the judge or the policeman or the person that represents the law.
Rendering unto
but it's
Caesar.
like, so if the judge is a representative of the law and then properly, shows the law down to the people, then just listen to their judgment. But if that judge then goes and gets prostitutes and does drugs or whatever, it's like, well, they don't follow what they do, or if they're a criminal. But it's still this idea that authority is a real aspect, and Christ is criticizing the hypocrisy, but he's saying authority is real. Like, this isn't a revolutionary thing, is what Jesus is also saying. I'm not going to revolt against the authority.
You're also, it's not excusable for you to throw out authority because some manifestations of authority are corrupt.
Yeah, that's right.
And the danger here, I think, that Dennis is pointing to particularly is that it's easy to use your observation of the imperfection of an authority to absolve yourself of moral responsibility. And you may be perfectly right, and the leftists are right about their critique, in some sense, of the corruption of power. Every human institution is corrupted by power. So what does that mean? Well, we throw everything up and burn it to the ground, and I have no responsibility. So, well, that's a little convenient for you, and so it's part of what John had referred to earlier, too, about this necessity of bringing together these opposites. Hypocrisy is not a good thing, and you hope that people optimally do what they say. But by the same token, you don't get to throw out everything they say because there's an observation of something they did that wasn't appropriate. People do this with Freud. They point to his hypothetical prejudice against women and dismiss everything he says. They do the same thing with Nietzsche. There's one error, and now I'm absolved of having to do the difficult work of absorbing all the wisdom.
People do this also with tweets.
Yeah, you might say so.
Well, that's exactly right.
All right.
And so as we're going to read the triumphal entry to Jerusalem for a question of time, it's important to understand that as Jesus is entering into Jerusalem, he has just resurrected a man that was dead for 3 days. And that this is also leading to the people of Jerusalem basically recognizing him as some kind of important figure, like as a king, as a savior, as the Messiah. Maybe that is what's happening. And so it's important to understand that it isn't just that he arrived and all of a sudden everybody just spontaneously starts to treat him that way, is that he has just done something that is now beyond all the other miracles that he's done, which isn't healing people, isn't, raising someone that just maybe died, but he says they're sleeping. No, he was in the tomb, he was wrapped for 3 days, and then he said, Lazarus, come out. And so the story of that spreads to Jerusalem, and now the people are ready to basically recognize him as possibly as their king.
Now, is that the precipitating event in your estimation of why the ministry comes to an end here and he enters into Jerusalem?
I don't know if it is in some ways a culmination, right? There's a crescendo of his revelation of the things that he does, and now this final miracle is in some ways showing himself as the master of life itself, and also it is pointing to his own resurrection ultimately as well.
Right. And there's no real miracle past that.
Yeah. No.
So that's a culmination of the ministry and the miracles in the raising of Lazarus.
We talked so much about how John the Baptist, what role symbolically is conscience, why he had to presage Jesus, but this is obviously another iteration of that. Like, why do you think that this last and final miracle is such a clear encapsulation of what he's to encounter?